Hi, welcome to another in a series of Newcastle Youth Studies Network seminars. Today we have Sherene Idriss from the Alfred Deakin Institute of Citizenship and Globalisation at Deakin University. And so what this is today is Sherene's presentation that unfortunately she couldn't do in the one we did last week that was on race and youth studies. And so we've asked Sherene to just present her presentation in this standalone presentation, and so we can hear about her work. And then I'll ask some similar questions that were asked in the proper session last week. So Sherene's the author of Young Migrant Identities, which is a really good book. I suggest everyone checks it out. And so I'll hand over to Sherene now.
Thanks for including me in this seminar and for that introduction. I will just jump straight into it for the sake of time. I want to begin by acknowledging that I am giving this talk on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people and acknowledge the ongoing struggle for Aboriginal sovereignty and pay my respects to elders past and present. This presentation is based off an article that will, I hope, be coming out shortly, where I trace the origins of Australian youth studies and consider how and where the concept of race fits in the field. And I was interested in doing this kind of review, I guess, essentially, because in the settler colonial context of Australia, the intersecting structural effects of race and class are disproportionately experienced by different cohorts of young people. But, and this is something that others have said, Sumi, for example, in this seminar, and people in different contexts, there's a lack of theoretical engagement with race in relation to youth culture's theorisation. My own understanding is that race and class are inseparable. And so this paper, the longer article, considers how and why race and class function as interrelated configurations of inequality. And to do that kind of work, I draw heavily on the scholarship of Stewart Hall and Paul Gilroy, two postcolonial scholars who made significant contributions to the development of the field of youth studies itself, as well as distinguished Professor Eileen Morton-Robinson, who provides what I think essentially is the scaffold for an Australian-specific critical race scholarship. And I can't give that whole paper, of course, but I thought I would just do two things for the purposes of this talk. The first is to just give some examples of the broader socioeconomic and political context to demonstrate how inequality is distributed in the Australian context and the material implications of this for young people, in young people's lives. And then the second part of the talk, I just trace a little bit about the key themes in Australian-specific youth culture studies and where I see some of the gaps in relation to race theorisation in this space. Okay, so where to start? Some of this might be known to people tuning in, but I felt it's important to just give some of the grounded evidence about what race and class inequality does and has done before launching into a discussion about race theory. As a settler colonial nation, Australia's early forms of governance were predicated on scientific racism that led to the genocide of Indigenous peoples, enslavement, and the forced removal of Aboriginal children from their homes. Critical race and critical Indigenous scholars track how neo-coloniality persists in present-day Australia. One of the clearest examples of this, though of course there are many others, is that at present, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people make up almost 50% of the youth justice system. In terms of how inequality, economic inequality is distributed more generally and how intimately structural racism is bound up in this, I thought I would just share this map of New South Wales. So the red zone is the most socio-economically disadvantaged municipal or council. I'll just use this laser pointer thing here. So that's the bit that I'm referring to here. And the blue zones are the wealthiest councils. So this one is Fairfield. It's home to a high population of Iraqi refugees. We've got Cumberland Council here and Bankstown Canterbury Council here. All three of these are really highly diverse regions and fall under the broad umbrella category of Western Sydney or Southwest Sydney, which has become really a shorthand and a catch-all category for social economic inequality and a site of moral panic over many things, but predominantly about things like homegrown terrorism and Muslim extremism, gun violence, et cetera, and mostly linking ethnicity and class explicitly to crime, to narratives about these things as being interrelated. Of note, apart from the large population of refugees in Fairfield, in that red zone that I pointed to, this is a place where Villawood Immigration Detention Centre currently exists. It's part of the local geography in a really obvious way. So, sorry, my laser pointer is a bit annoying. So that's it there. You can see the local high school's not too far away. You know, Woodville Road's shops and pizza shops and cafes and whatever. So it's really obvious. It's really a clear part of the local landscape. And so young people, many of them from refugee backgrounds themselves, who live in Fairfield, in this council more generally, but in these suburbs, are not in the dark about the fact that this immigration detention centre exists and houses people that come from backgrounds similar to theirs. What I find the most interesting about this map is that when you pan out, so this is the same map, I've just zoomed out a little bit or zoomed in a little bit, can't remember. No, I think I zoomed out a bit. Fairfield is one of the only, sorry, no, let me just go back a second. Yes, so the other map is closer, but up here we've got two other red zones, two of the most disadvantaged councils further up here. But as we get closer, we see that this council is the only red zone that exists this close to so many blue zones. So many councils that are home to the most wealth in Sydney, in New South Wales. And so the disparity is incredibly stark when you think about the fact that people living in Fairfield will probably be travelling and studying in some of those blue zones. So over here is like inner city Sydney. And here are some of the beaches, the eastern suburb beaches. And so people from the poorest parts of town are travelling into the inner city for work and for school. But people from those wealthy suburbs are not going to be venturing out to southwest Sydney. So I think the geography of class and racial inequality is incredibly important to highlight in this context. To give just another example of the geography of class and racial inequality, it's also notable that this week an investigation found that the New South Wales government handpicked and distributed $90 million of funding to one of the councils in these blue zones. I think it was Hornsby Council. Under a scheme that the rest of the councils were unaware that they had the opportunity to even apply for. So this is just another small example of how class and racial inequality is maintained and really perpetuated at a state level, essentially. Where it relates specifically to young people, class and race, we've seen in the last week or so reporting showing that suburbs with higher populations of Indigenous and African Australian young men have higher rates of penalties for breaching COVID restrictions, in direct contrast to the rates of COVID cases in those suburbs. So this is just a map that shows that these red circles are where the numbers of COVID cases were taking place, I guess, where we had more cases. So these are the eastern suburbs, that's Bondi Beach, and this is Fairfield. So the red circle is much smaller, and further out around here, around Blacktown and Parramatta, those and Mount Druitt, those are some of the suburbs that had much higher rates of penalties, and those are also the same suburbs that have higher populations of Indigenous and African Australian communities. And I think what that really shows is the fundamental over-policing of these populations. So what I do in the longer version of the paper is I use these examples and many others going back to the 1990s to consider how youthfulness and youth cultural expression is an unevenly experienced set of practices and set of embodiments within this broader context. And again, some of this is well known to us, but just to quickly recap, the hegemony of youth studies is predominantly focused on how young people become adult. And this question is usually interrogated through the lens of the familial, class, and capitalist structures under which they live. So Joanna Wynne explains that prior to the 1990s, there's little interest in really theorising youth as a process. And youth studies really takes off from the 1990s through to the mid-2000s, during which, against the backdrop of neoliberal policies, the failing nexus between education and work fueled an interest in youth transitions. And at the same time, this is a direct quote from her, at the same time, the field of youth cultural and subcultural studies highlighted the diversity of young people's expression and the changing nature of cultural identifications. And so historically, subculture is analysed as a strategy and expression of resistance. More recent conceptualizations of affective performances of youth, gender and sexuality have been expanded to address the demands placed on young people to perform aesthetic forms of labour in the new economy. The empirical data in the Australian research provides a nuanced approach to femininities, masculinities, their relationship to contemporary experiences of work, lifestyles, and youth cultures. And a recent trend is to show how neoliberal agendas of reflexivity, entrepreneurship, and individualism become internalized by some young people who participate in specific youth cultures from which they can extract a kind of capital from their youthfulness that helps them in the labour market. And within that research agenda, that broader research agenda and those trends, there is a sense really that race doesn't matter in current accounts of young people's lives in Australia. And when tacit negotiations of sexuality, gender and class are analysed in Australian youth culture studies, the intersections of these processes with that of racialisation is often not extensively interrogated. And instead, there's been an overriding focus on identifiable groups whose experiences of racism are framed through the prism of cultural difference. While ethnic identity making and performativity have been captured in Australian research more generally, those studies tend to sit within parallel agendas that speak to discourses of multiculturalism and migration, and less so to do with youthfulness or youth cultural expression. So the specificities of how racialisation plays out in different ways for different groups of young people really requires theoretical tools that can move between negotiation and contestation of the life phase of youth and more macro accounts that put the systemic institutional investment in whiteness under the microscope. And I think this really is where the gap is in the theoretical developments around race and youth culture studies in Australia. The youthful experience is essentially a white experience, and the experiences of Black and brown young people is seen to be a deviation from the existing theoretical standpoints, rather than being deeply intertwined with how we make sense of youth cultural expression and participation. So for me, to fill that gap, Stewart Hall's work on race as a discursive floating signifier has been very useful. And this is obviously older work, but I think it's really relevant to the stuff that's going on today. So what he says, I'll just say it really quickly because I realize I'm running out of time, that the repetition of symbols, codes, and markers across and within institutions, particularly in popular culture and media, generate how we view and interpret racialized bodies and groups as part of a classificatory social system. The effects of race thinking are material in that they reproduce racism and inequality in new coded forms that shape young people's lives in profound ways, rendering some young people folk devils. So we could see that earlier with the repetitive associations between particular migrant groups and Indigenous young people as a threat and as in need of surveillance and policing, leading to then higher penalties of COVID-related penalties for breaching the restrictions. So this affects how and what youth cultures means for those racialized young people. The very nature of their participation in leisure and subcultural scenes is established because of where they live, how they're perceived by society, and what they have access to, essentially. The notion that from youth cultures, a young person can extract a kind of capital to leverage in a do-it-yourself job market, which is kind of one of the trends in youth culture studies research at the moment, plays out very differently when we look at marginalized young people. And this is what I've tried to show in some of my other empirical work in this space. So focusing on the signification of race, the encoding and decoding practices that are put to work in different contexts means there's no end fixed point at which we have all the answers about how race reproduces itself. Unlike earlier functionalist Marxists, Hall rejected the notion that race operates in a universal way or that these categories fix people into place. But he also doesn't reduce race as a technology of power to just existing in the realm of the performative or the symbolic. What Hall made visible is that all young people live racially structured lives. And indeed, youth studies in its early form played an important role against culturalist accounts of ethnicity that sidestepped questions about individual proximity to power and authority. So at the time of writing There Ain't No Black, Paul Gilroy explained that the conversation over the meaning and signification of race has taken place in and around youth cultures and subcultures since their formation. And so fast forward to today, and in the Australian context, we can see similar patterns operating here where the capacity to become adult is unevenly experienced according to one's negatively racialized position that curtails opportunities for sociality and fun in specific ways. And so I have this quote here from an Australian drill group 1-4 who've gained quite a bit of popularity, especially overseas, about how the police manage their capacity to play gigs and to earn a living, I guess, to show how this kind of manifests in very specific ways. And so in turn, and to conclude, I guess, what this means is that youthful forms of creative and cultural expression need to be interrogated as, in and of themselves, classed, gendered, and raced. And this is what I'm working on at the moment. And I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Awesome, thanks, Sherene. That was really good. I think, yeah, I think everything you say there makes a lot of sense in terms of the way that the history of the youth studies has played out. So maybe we'll talk about that in a sec. I really love that last quote there. They want us to get off the street, yet they won't give us a chance to. And I think that, really efficiently sums up the kind of, on the one hand, the kind of disciplinary lens on young people in public space and the way that that's, very obviously race and class in terms of the way that's applied. Yet then in terms of policy and, governmental attitudes towards young people, all those things are getting taken away. And so, young people are largely left with nowhere to go unless you've got lots of money. So, I think that's a really beautiful sociological statement at the end there. That's great.
Yeah, and I think really why I like this quote so much is because I think what it shows is that even the way that racialized young people, their sociological imagination, involves a very clear understanding of their relationship with authority and power and the state in ways that I think, maybe wealthier kids don't. It's not even something that would cross their minds.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's it's a really good example of reflexivity of their place in social space. I mean, some of the work I do is like being against this idea of young people as cultural dupes, and I think that's good evidence of showing someone has a really realistic understanding of where they are. Yeah. Okay, so I'll ask you now the actual questions that were asked to the other speakers in the seminar the other day. So I'm going to have to read these. So number one. The speakers in this session were mostly using forms of ethnographic methodologies, to some degree in the research anyway. So is these similar methods that you use in your work, and as opposed to say surveys and interviews, and how does this help make the configurations of race and class and youth? How does this help us kind of shine a light on that nexus?
Yeah, I mean, definitely for the book, I did employ an ethnographic approach, and thanks for the plug. And why I think that it can illustrate certain dynamics around how race and class and youth intersect differently to maybe other methods, is, well, a few things. One is that in Australia, the geography is really important, and that's something that I think when we import maybe British or other theoretical tools to make sense of things like racism or class analysis, it doesn't play out the same way. You know, we don't have the inner city is not the same as the inner cities in different places that are potentially negative, you know, high socioeconomic disadvantage, for example. It's different here. So I think that ethnographic approach allows you to get a sense of what's happening on the ground, and just the dynamism of race and class as it's lived and experienced in specific local spaces that you can't get at, I think, with other methods.
Yeah, definitely, I agree. Can you make an example of like that, maybe an instance of that in your own research where that's happened?
Yeah. Okay. So, for example, I think so for my PhD research, I was looking at young Arab Australian men's creative vocational aspirations who come from the socioeconomically disadvantaged suburbs of southwest Sydney, predominantly that Bankstown Council region. And I think if you look at it topographically, these are the suburbs, and the suburbs evoke a different, I think, imagination in places like the US or places like the UK, where these are, you know, this is where the middle class lives. That's not the case in New South Wales, in Sydney, for example. The suburbs are really home to large populations of non-English speaking migrant backgrounds, a lot of underfunded public schools, and the travel time, the distance to get anywhere, you know, by public transport. So for a young person, especially if you want to have that kind of career that is about being in the creative clusters, you know, you have to be part of the scene. You know this obviously. You have to be part of the scene, and so if you live regionally or if you live in these suburbs, it's very hard to get in and out of. The actual infrastructure makes it difficult. So that's, I think, one example, I guess.
Good example. Okay. The other next question that was asked at the actual seminar as well was, so thinking about the legacies of race theory in youth studies, I suppose Hall and Gilroy are definitely the major voices, I suppose. What do you think is important to retain from earlier conceptual approaches for understanding racialization processes and racisms today?
Okay. I think a lot of it is still valuable, but I also think that at the same time that we can learn a lot from Stewart Hall's work and Paul Gilroy's work. There's also really a critical need to build, an Australian-specific scholarly approach to race and youth studies, and part of that, a large part of that, is because of the fact that this is a settler colonial state, which is different to the to the relationship between racialized subjects in places like the UK and state and power. But the other thing that we can really retain, I think, is the fact that in some of these early conceptions, it's very clear that what they're talking about is the way in which neoliberal policies and capitalist expansion is intimately tied into the management of racialized subjects. And so, for example, just today or yesterday, really, there's, under the new budget in Australia, we see that there's new rules about whether you can get a visa based on whether you can speak English, for example. And so this kind of border management, and that falls under the budget. So it's intimately tied into the wealth, the economic growth of the nation. So I think that nexus between capitalism and racialization is really about understanding how power is unevenly distributed.
Definitely. Are there other, beyond Gilroy and Hall that you'd suggest that people check out? I've been reading books called Carceral Capitalism and Gore Capitalism that kind of bring a lot of these kind of global issues together to think about how race and capitalism and disciplinary kind of measures that are a part of that happen, I suppose. Are there other people you could
So specifically to youth studies, or in
Not
general?
necessarily, just theorists or
Yeah, I mean, Eileen Morton Robinson's work around the white possessive, I think, is really seminal. Um, what else is good? You put me on the spot a little bit.
sorry.
That's okay, but I think maybe I'll maybe I'll get back to you.
Okay, yep, no worries.
Definitely,
Yep.
I mean, there's critical work that's done around racial capitalism. One of the challenges of critical race scholarship is that a lot of it, I mein, it sort of kicks off in the US, and it's a different context. I think there's a lot to learn from it, but definitely, Eileen Morton Robinson's work that brings together some of those threads as it relates to the settler colonial state has been very helpful for me, at least.
Okay. The third question, and this I suppose relates to the whole presentation in a way that you and what you're saying is, why do you think race and racism somewhat fell off the radar in youth studies? Or maybe another way to put it, why wasn't it more important to begin with? And why is whiteness so under theorized, especially in settler colonial contexts?
So this is how I came to this longer paper that I've written, because I think I did my PhD in an interdisciplinary institute, mostly cultural studies, a bit of anthropology and sociology, and I didn't know that race wasn't part of youth studies. So my supervisors were writing at that intersection, so Professor Greg Noble and Professor George Morgan. And so for me, Greg's book about Bin Laden in the suburbs does these things, and so I thought that that's what youth studies was doing, and it wasn't until then I started to try to figure out, okay, so post PhD, where who am I in conversation with, and then I sort of realized that actually there is this gap. I don't have a very clear idea of why that's the case, but my sense is that the very Australian specific policies of multiculturalism mean that there is this whole body of literature around how multiculturalism plays out, everyday multiculturalism, and a whole bunch of scholarship around that. And I think that questions about race, ethnicity, the performativity of ethnicity, social inclusion, belonging, all those things tend to fall within that body of work. And youth studies has taken a different approach, I think.
I think that's a really good answer. I mean, I always saw Kids, Kebabs, Cops and Crime as like a canonical kind of Australian youth studies text, right. But like it's not really kind of considered youth studies in a way, I suppose. And
well, I think
it's been on the sidelines of what we've considered youth studies in Australia, and it's not in the centre of it. Yeah.
I think, for example, maybe this isn't for the recording, I don't know, but like I think of the cohort that was supervised by Greg, and I think a lot of those students moved into migration and multicultural studies and multiculturalism, and I think part of it is maybe it's also a question of methodology, because that work I think comes from what Paul Gilroy and Stewart Hall were also doing, which is purely cultural studies and named as such, which isn't a discipline, I guess. Maybe it is now, but it wasn't, and I don't think that that book would consider itself as sociological. Maybe youth studies is a bit more sociological.
I think that's true. And I think the other thing is historically that, and like academia is really white. Youth studies and the foundational people in it were as well, but I think there's been this thing in youth studies where we've focused on not necessarily being insider research, but particularly people tend to research things that they're interested in or know about, or have sympathy with, and that has led, particularly in youth cultural studies, I think, because to the more kind of white subcultures and stuff like that has been the dominant forms over the years. So I think there's something kind of, if you did sociological analysis of who the youth studies people are, I think that kind of bears out in why this has been largely sidelined, or like secondary consideration of the field. And yeah, I'm hoping that is changing. I think maybe too, like maybe we shouldn't get too bogged down in like calling things youth studies and calling things migration studies and stuff as well. Like,
Yeah,
you know, we can use all that stuff. Yeah, yeah,
I think yeah, I think that's one of the things as well is you know, who counts as youth studies.
yeah,
You know, that really makes a difference to how you see what the field is doing. But I think there are definitely some clear, you know, metrics. I mean, you know, we can think about, you know, the TASA youth stream, for example, the
yep,
Australian Sociological Association's youth stream, and what it has done, for example,
yep,
historically. So that could be, yeah, one way of thinking about who's in and not in youth studies.
yeah,
But I think what you say is true. And I think as well, you know, this is perhaps one of the outcomes of, you know, multiculturalism more generally, and the theorization of it and the research that happens is, and this is something that Paul Gilroy talks about, is that, you know, something that tends to happen in that space is a focus on the minutiae of ethnicity and of cultural practices, and less about, I think, the fact that those young people who are in those communities have interests elsewhere. And I think that, I mean, for me, that was the impetus behind my PhD research, was that, you know, I just couldn't bring myself to do just another, or be involved in a project that was just going to tell us that racialized young people experience racism. I mean, it's like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, they're
yep,
racialized, all the other, you know, markers are there, like the graphs I showed, for example. It's all kind of known. So then are there other ways in which we can get at the lived experience of racism,
yep,
or you know, the kind of structural constraints around being a young person in different ways.
yep,
I think I've just
yep.
confused myself, but anyway.
No, no, it's good.
Never mind.
Okay, well, we might leave it there. So thanks so much for joining us, and yeah, thanks again for taking part.
No worries. Thank you so much.
Thanks.